This is lecture 74 on primitive communism in Arabia, northern and eastern Africa, and specifically the Lower Paleolithic. It's also the first lecture of a series of lectures that are going to accompany Volume 6 on communism in Africa, which will be available this summer, probably in June. And so we'll have a total of 6 volumes in this year's edition. At any rate, when I took my first course in archaeology in the fall of 1966 as an undergraduate at Los Angeles City College, what was known of Arabia and Africa for the Lower Paleolithic was very little. The work of Louis S.B. Leakey was just beginning to be popularized on television by National Geographic. And the combination of that course in the Introduction to Archaeology by Jerry Jones and the TV show was enough to convince me to change my major from biochemistry to archaeology, and by the end of the semester I found the University of Calgary and its new Department of Archaeology in a guide to universities in the English-speaking world in the LACC library, and I had decided that that was where I would get my PhD. Of course, I still had to get my BA, and decided to do that at California State College, Los Angeles, as my next step. And the following year, I was at Cal State LA doing that when Louis Leakey visited Los Angeles, and he was on his first USA trip at the invitation of a local supporting group. My wife, Rachel, and I went to his first lecture, and in the spring I signed up for my first field course in archaeology at the University of California, Los Angeles, for the summer of 1967. Now, some of you will be, if not most of you, be too young to remember that the U.S. imperialists were deeply involved in trouble in Vietnam, as its Communist Party was leading a very successful anti-imperialist war with the support of the Soviet Union, China, and the Socialist Bloc in East Europe and Cuba. Now, I had been active with the Chinese-lining Progressive Labor Party. For those of you that are too young to remember all of this, that was when Mao Zedong and Frank Pistona supported a Communist Party led by Mort Scheer and Milt Rosen, replacing the revisionist CPUSA that was supporting the Soviet Union. Now, graduating from CSCLA in August of 1968, I went on to Calgary, where I had been accepted, and I started in September of '68, continuing my study of Old World Paleolithic archaeology under Professor Vladimir Markotic, I think probably a better way of pronouncing it. All of these people are dead now, but this continues to be the case. We'll see as I'm going to mention a few things that are rather personal later on, but it won't affect anybody because they're already dead. Now, over half a century later, there had been an avalanche of archaeological interdisciplinary studies from both Arabia and Africa, and I'm going to take us through this in both summary and detail this morning. A first task of contemporary investigators has been to establish the possible routes across the Red Sea in the north, and the obvious route was across the land connection from Africa through the Levant coast of the Near East. From the south, there was a land bridge across the Red Sea, which I'm going to point out on a map here in just a minute. And it's been there, that land bridge, off and on for the last several million years. It was utilized during those times, and when submerged would have been traversed by the genus Homo in even its earliest form, using boats. Now, a second task had been to determine what inland routes may have been used by Homo to cross the Saudi Arabian mainland, and in this latter regard it is now obvious that people crossed directly across Saudi Arabia when it was feasible over the last 2 million years. Much of that land is now covered in sand features and inaccessible to archaeology, but at that time it was rather easy for people to walk right across an area which looked probably like the Great Basin did before the desiccation that began 10,000 years ago. Now, the biological Lower Paleolithic begins with Homo australopithecus in Africa and extends through Homo erectus in Africa and Asia. In fact, it includes Homo sapiens in the entire Old World, between 1,000,000 and 300,000 years ago. Now, Arabia and North Africa have a Lower Paleolithic record that begins with pre-Oldowan rocks that were used without being worked further. And these are pebbles that where you've had one or two flakes knocked off of them. And they're named Oldowan after Olduvai Gorge, which I'm going to point out here in a moment. And then it continues with the presence of Oldowan tools dated to 1.8 million years ago in northern Africa or in northern Algeria. And this is followed there and everywhere else in the Old World by the Acheulean, with hand axes formed by flakes removed on both sides of these tools. And thus the expansion of the cognitive ability of Homo from the Australopithecus grade to the Erectus grade is proven. And in the first week of August 2016, there was a conference at Eberhard Karls University in Tübingen, Germany, where the environmental picture has become clearer for this part of the Lower Paleolithic. Adrian Parker reported some conclusions on how the landscape of the peninsula changed over its Lower Paleolithic occupation as follows. He says, hand axe discussions began in two talks detailing the work of the Paleo Deserts team, Hugh Grocut and Eleanor Scarry's presentations based on the setting and detailed morphology of hand axes associated with fossil lake deposits in northwestern Saudi Arabia, posed questions of potential links to the Lower Paleolithic industries of the Levant, as well as potential chronological trend in the shape of hand axes changing with occupations during each phase of lake development. Stephanie Bonellari reported a hint of the possible Lower Paleolithic record of northern Oman in the form of two hand axes found during the survey of the extensive Middle Paleolithic deposits from that area. And my presentation marked, he says, a bit of a break, perhaps mainly but not completely, due to our lack of beautiful hand axes in southwest Saudi Arabia, focusing on an overview of the approaches we've taken and are developing in the Surface project. The Surface is capitalized, S-U-R-F-A-C-E. The types of Lower Paleolithic types of artifacts we are finding and what their distribution in the landscape can tell us about its past behavior. Sari Shipton presented how the landscapes and lithics of Dawadmi and other interior regions can begin to tell us about Lower Paleolithic landscape use, with a record that is strikingly similar to those from our Red Sea study area. And that Dawadmi is just about 60 miles north of Riyadh, and I'll point that out in a moment here on the map in a moment. Knut Bretsky introduced a potential Lower Paleolithic surface assemblage from Sharjah of the United Arab Emirates, and discussions surrounding grappling with the issues of assigning a date or time to surface assemblages through technological attributes. Knut also read a presentation sent by Hazri Amirkhanov detailing some tantalizing glimpses of the Lower Paleolithic in Yemen. Now, the last Arabian representation came from Yamande Hilbert, who presented an overview of the variability of hand axes across sites in Oman and Saudi Arabia. Now, strikingly, one theme that began to emerge in the workshop was that only in northwest Saudi do we have Boxgrove, England quality hand axes in the Arabian record. The rest of our hand axes are a bit more rough and ready, but what Yamandu asked, did this matter if a few rough blows gave you enough of an edge to catch and butcher your next meal? To sum up and kickstart a leisurely but stimulating discussion, Nick Conrad put the Arabian material into context of work he coordinates at the Tübingen as part of the ROCEEH project, the role of culture in early expansion of humans. Over 10 years into a 20-year run, this project encompasses work in Arabia, South Africa, Armenia, and beyond, and is an enviable model of comparative study of trajectories of culture change across time and space during the Paleolithic. Now, no workshop could be complete without a field trip, and while Arabia was a little far for a day trip, Tübingen's history of leading excavations at world-famous Middle to Upper Paleolithic sites in the Swabian Jura is a part of Germany, provided an excellent opportunity to be shown the classic sites of Hohlfels, another German site currently under excavation, and Geisenkosterli, as well as a myriad of museums displaying finds from both in Tübingen and the region. The material recovered from these sites and others nearby is absolutely exceptional, including amazingly preserved carved ivory figurines of people and animals, bone flutes, and most recently a potential rope maker, providing an unparalleled insight into early Upper Paleolithic symbolism from 30 to 40,000 years ago. Now, overall, the chance to join nearly all the researchers examining the Lower Paleolithic in Arabia at the same table at that moment, we do fit around one table, to discuss this native knowledge, compare notes, and identify future avenues for research and collaboration was a fantastic one. Made all the more enjoyable through a wonderful hospitality of Knut, Nick, and the department at Tübingen in its most beautiful castle surroundings. And he thanks everybody involved. Adrian Parker is the author of the book, The Lower Paleolithic of Arabia. Now, what Lower Paleolithic is accessible in Arabia today lies on the edges of the Arabian Peninsula in Saudi Arabia, Oman, and Yemen. And the rest of it, of course, has been covered up by sand that didn't exist at the time our first primitive communists moved across that area. Now, Professor George Bailey and his associates are an excellent place for serious archaeology students to begin their study of Arabian and North African primitive communism of the hunting and gathering mode of production during the Lower Paleolithic. Now, in terms of North Africa and the Lower Paleolithic, the earliest inhabitants of central North Africa have left behind significant remains. Early remnants of hominid occupation in North Africa, for example, were found in Ain el Hanek near Saida that date 200,000 years ago. And then there are more recent investigations that have found signs of Oldowan technology there and indicate a date of up to 1.8 million years ago. North Africa was the site of the highest state of development of the Middle Paleolithic, flake tool techniques. Tools of this era, being dated as early as 130,000 BP, are called Anterior, after the type site Bir el Alter, south of Annaba. The specialized variety and workmanship are proof of the emergence of a broad spectrum wild resource exploitation among humans of North Africa. At Nazlet Sabaha in Egypt, people engaged in chert mining for tool preforms by 100,000 years ago. Human habitation in North Africa has been greatly influenced by the climate of the Sahara, currently the world's largest warm desert, which has undergone enormous variations between wet and dry over the last few 100,000 years. And this may be due to a 41,000-year cycle in which the tilt of the Earth changes between 22 degrees and 24.5 degrees. At present, that is AD 2000s more or less, we are in a dry period, but it's expected that the Sahara will become green again in 15,000 years. During the last glacial period, the Sahara was much larger than it is today, extending south beyond its current boundaries. The end of the glacial period brought more rain to the Sahara, so from about 10,000 to 8,000 BP, perhaps because of low pressure area over the collapsing ice sheets to the north, its margins began to change. Now, once the ice sheets were gone, the northern Sahara dried up. In the southern Sahara, the drying trend was initially counteracted by the monsoon, which brought rain further north than it does today. So, by around 6,200 BP, however, the monsoon had retreated south to approximately where it is today, leading to the desertification of the Sahara. So the Sahara is now as dry as it was about 13,000 years ago. During periods of a wet or green Sahara, the Sahara becomes a savanna grassland with appropriate flora and fauna. Following interpluvial arid periods, the Sahara area reverts to desert conditions, and the flora and fauna are forced to retreat northwards to the Atlas Mountains, southwards into West Africa, or eastwards into the Nile Valley. This separates populations of some of the animal species and plant species in areas with different climates forcing them to adapt, possibly giving rise to allopatric speciation. And now I'm going to move over to the map and talk about some specific sites, Ein Hanek and El Kerba to begin with, which are located in the high plateau of northeastern Algeria, and where we have dates of 2.2 million years ago. Now we're going to take a look at some of the spots that I've already talked about and that we're going to continue to talk about this morning. First of all, this is North Oman and that part of Saudi Arabia where we have early, that is Lower Paleolithic sites dating 2 million years ago. This is Yemen, and this is the area of connection which I said has been a land bridge off and on for the last couple of million years from Africa into Arabia. So people would walk across there if they wanted to. They could go right across there, or they could go into Arabia this way, across the Levant. And so that takes us through that. And as I've said just a minute ago, we're going to go over here to Algeria. And the first sites I want to take a look at are going to be right here and in Algeria, that is in northwest Algeria. And then there's another one at about 2 million years right here in northern Algeria. So we have humans 2 million years ago, which were either very advanced Australopithecines or Homo erectus types that were there, and that's what we're talking about here, because these are the very first humans in the world, and they are, of course, all primitive communists, and this is all of the Lower Paleolithic. And then we're going to go to I just mentioned those Algerian sites. Then we're going to go over here just real briefly to this part of the Nile where there's a chert mine that dates 100,000 years ago. So it is Paleolithic, but at that date it's be Middle Paleolithic. And then we're going to talk about the Ein Harak and El Kerba sites in Algeria, again, which are over here, or actually over there. That's northeast Algeria. Then we're going to go to West Turkana, Kenya, the Lomeki site, which is 3.3 million years ago, and Kenya is right here. And that's also the area where it's these three areas, Kenya, Tanganyika, and Uganda, are the most important areas archaeologically, where we have lots of good proof for the kinds of tools that Lower Paleolithic primitive communists were using, and Olduvai Gorge, which is right in there. So now you know where you are kind of geographically. When I took a look at this map when I was getting this lecture prepared, I was reminded that the world expert on this part of the world was an archaeologist named Peter Shinny. And in my last year of residence at the University of Calgary in my doctoral program, he was selected to come to be our new chairman at the Department of Archaeology. The dean had conducted a worldwide search for an archaeologist in the English-speaking world who would be acceptable to everybody in the department, and that would give the university the kind of high standing it already had achieved with regard to archaeology. One of the people he brought in was this fellow Peter Shinny, who was an expert on this part of the world. Now, when Shinny came over, he brought a wife with him who was a typical British wife, the kind that you see on television of the upwardly mobile, I can't remember the name of that particular show, but upwardly mobile type of English woman who was certainly very acceptable to the board of governors at the university that had to make a decision. And so anyway, after they had interviewed people from different countries around the world, mostly from Europe, of course, and North America, they decided on Shinny, and he was appointed. Now they pay a lot of money to professors, like $250,000 a year in Calgary, at that time at least, and so this was a plum job. Shinny would make more money in 1 year than he probably made in all his life when he was working over here. So at any rate, when he came back, he had a new wife, and she was as black as coal. And it was obvious that
he had brought over a woman who would be acceptable to the Board of Governors, and that she had gone along with it because she also was going to make more money. She'd get half of his salary, I suppose, than she'd ever had in her life. So that's, but he knew that if he brought a black girl over there who was like 30 years old at the most, that he would never get appointed. So, because that's just the nature of North American society at that time. At any rate, that's just a little aside. I'm going to give you a few more as we progress through these lectures because, as it turns out, my trip to London in 1961 was an eye-opener for me. The African Communist was just being published, and I was meeting with the leaders of the Communist Party of Great Britain. All of this time I was in U.S. Army intelligence, but I was on a vacation. So I've got a lot of insights to talk about with regard to the civil wars that were going on in South Africa, Joe Slovo and the Legion that was funded for various kinds of communist intervention in Africa, based on my own personal experience. So now we're going to go back to our lecture, to my presentation. Now, going back to Ain Hanek and El Kerba, these sites I just pointed out in northeast Algeria, close to the ocean, are located on a high plateau. And they have Pliocene horizons that begin about 2.2 million years ago. Now, the paleontological record documents the spread of early Pleistocene animals and the genus Homo from further south into northern Africa. The humans made stone tools of the Oldowan variety, and lithic remains are mixed with those of hunted animals, including horses, cows, rhinoceroses, and elephants. Now, the stone tools are reliably dated. There's a journal article that I quote, I won't do it here, in Journal of Archaeological Science with the dates and Journal of Human Evolution, both of those in 1998 to 2003, for Ain Hanek and El Kerba that are put at 1.8 million years ago. And these are reliable dates. So the Oldowan technology is the earliest archaeological evidence in North Africa and was clearly related to the 3.3 million year old Cafuan type of technology in Kenya. In your book, there's going to be a chapter on the fossil apes, which I'm not going to go through here, but it'll be there for those of you who want to know where these homos evolved from and how they did it. Now, at any rate, beginning in 1992, excavation by Stone Age Institute researcher Dr. Mohammed Sanouni were conducted there, and they produced a large number of Oldowan artifacts and well-preserved animal fossils sealed in fine-grained silts. This context has provided excellent preservation and thus clear evidence of early hominid occupation. This site and El Kerba have been revisited and restudied several times since then. In Algeria of North Africa, a locality is found to yield a series of crudely worked pebble tools in association with the undisputed Lower Pleistocene Villafranchian mammalian assemblage. Villafranchian is a type of a group of mammals that, at any rate. This is one of the earliest sites to produce implements of definite human manufacture. Lower Paleolithic hand axes of both the Chilean-Abavillian and Achulian type, along with the variety of flake tools, have been recovered in great numbers from several sites throughout Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, and also in the Sahara region. These are comparable to those of Western Europe. The climate was less arid in comparison to the present day. However, it was definitely warm and wet, wet enough to support the hippopotamus, as evidenced by the fossil remains. And these fossil remains are heavily weathered and patinated. Patina is something that forms on a rock or bone, which has been exposed to for long periods of time to weathering. In some cases, the stone tools are found in direct stratigraphic association with early fauna. Now, the Lower Paleolithic is the earliest subdivision, as you know, of the Paleolithic or Old Stone Age, and begins, as we can see now, 3.3 million years ago, with recovery of stone tools made by Homo at the Lomekwi site in West Turkana, Kenya. And from that 3.3 million year date, it lasts until 300,000 years ago, that is the Lower Paleolithic. In other words, the Lomekwian stone tools define the beginning of the Lower Paleolithic, and the Lower Paleolithic that evolved into the Oldowan and subsequent Acheulean cultures with their diagnostic stone industries. Now at that time, by definition, all these homos were all Australopithecine, that is, the first of the three grades of humans, that is, with an average of 500 cubic centimeters of cranial capacity in their skull, which is the key thing. And then, by definition again, by 2 million years ago, they would have evolved to becoming Homo erectus. And by 1 million years ago, all homos in this model we're following are Homo sapiens. Relevant recent references are from Sonia Harmand and her associates in Nature magazine in May of 2015. They wrote an article called 3.3 million year old stone tools from Lomeki 3 in West Turkana, Kenya. And another article, Early Stone Age Tools, What Does It Mean to Be Human, from the Smithsonian magazine in 2014. And Lawrence Barham and Peter Mitchell wrote an article in 2008 called The First Africans, African Archaeology from the Earliest Tool Makers to Most Recent Foragers. In your text you have the full references for all of this. Now by definition, again, the earliest stone tools were made by Homo australopithecus. This first stone tool technological revolution occurred during a period of climate change and the spread of savanna grasslands. However, remember that primary causation lies internally, and in this case in the reliance on stone, bone, and wood tools. What was secondary always in causation was environmental fluctuation. The most important new field results come from West Turkana, Kenya, and as we've seen, these findings of 3.3 million years ago prove the emergence of the first component of culture in the form of technology we call Oldowan, or in other words, in the forces of production. These forces are the first half of the mode of production. If we have one component of the mode of production, then by definition we had to have the second component of the mode of production, or the relations of production as they're also called. You'll recall that Karl Marx used the terms forces of production and relations of production. Leslie White, in his struggle to make Marxism acceptable in North America, changed those terms to technology and social organization. I've gone over this with you before, but I'll just mention it again now. Social organization is the way people employed this technology. And arising upon that, of course, was their consciousness, their worldview, or what Marx called superstructure, White called ideology. Now this stupendous find comes from the discovery of Lomekwi of a 3.3 million year old archaeological site, where here we have in situ stone artifacts associated with Pleistocene hominid fossils in a wooded paleo environment. The Lomekwi stone tool makers had a sophisticated understanding of stone fracture properties, proven by their stone to pebble reduction via flake removal. And these investigators proposed the name Lomekwian for these pre-Oldowan tools that are 700,000 years older than the Oldowan industries from Olduvai Gorge. Now, the East African Lower Paleolithic, then, is where we want to turn our attention. And there are three nations important to the Lower Paleolithic in East Africa. These are Kenya, Tanganyika, and Uganda. Now, first of all, after 1952, W.W. Bishop and L.S.B. Leakey started their systematic investigation on the stone tool cultures of Kenya, where we now have the earliest ape skulls. Secondly, from northern Tanganyika, we have the discovery of pre-Zinjanthropus from Olduvai Gorge, and that fossil is the first tool-making hominid skeleton known there. In Uganda in 1930, E.J. Wayland identified several distinct cultures, including the Kafuan, Sangoan, and Magosian cultures. All have yielded numerous crude pebble tools that show primary flaking on one end. They come from a bed of the earliest Lower Paleolithic, Dr. Leakey did a great deal of intensive work in this area, identifying a series of sites now designated as the Cafuan culture. And Oldowan Gorge, just to remind you, is about 60 miles south of Nairobi, which is where, at that time, Leakey was based. Now, what is the Cafuan? Cafuan is a human culture older than the Oldowan and yet post-Lomekwian. In the Cafuan, pebbles are worked on one side only. The chief diagnostic of the Oldowan pebbles is that they are worked on two sides, along the edge instead of just on one side, as found in the Cafuan culture. Now, importantly, the Oldowan culture shows a definite Abavillian and Acheulean predisposition. You can see that these, when you take this kind of a view, you can see how people were, over hundreds of thousands of years, they were making their stone tools in an increasingly sophisticated way. Now, moreover, in Uganda, such layers include plenty of typical Lavoisian flakes and the tortoise cores from which they were struck. There's a very nice moving picture of how a Lavoisian core or tortoise core is reduced. And all you have to do is type that into your Google, and it'll come up, and you can see it's not. Somehow they've set it up so that it actually is moving. Now, chronologically, the Cafuan belongs to the Lower Pleistocene pluvial period called the Kageran. Now, what is the Mysterion? A cultural level called Kenya Flowersmith appears with well-developed hand axes and Mysterion flakes. Mysterion refers to the variety of stone tools used in broad-spectrum wild resource exploitation that began by about 110,000 years ago. Originally, this culture was found in association with classic Neanderthal fossils. However, we know now that the Mysterion was far more widely distributed in the Old World and among all varieties of Homo sapiens, not just the Neanderthalensis subspecies. And that's all Neanderthal is a subspecies of Homo sapiens. At a higher stratigraphic level, two distinct cultures are recorded as the Kenya Stilbe and Kenya Capsium. These are the Abavillian and Acheulean of East Africa. They belong to the Middle Pleistocene and are contemporary to the Second or Comasian pluvial period, and are contemporary with the East African Upper Pleistocene Fourth pluvial period, named the Gamblian. Now, more on the Cafuan. As we've seen, the culture of the Lower Pleistocene is the Cafuan, and it is contemporary to the first pluvial period called Kageran. The name derives from a site in Uganda's Kafu Valley. Here in 1919, Professor Whalen discovered the pebble tools belonging to this culture, and as I say, crude primary flaking is limited to one end only, and that characterizes or is diagnostic for these tools. Otherwise, they have a pebble cortex. The tools are long, broad, and classified into three subdivisions. Now, first we have the early Cafuan, which is a category of diagnostically long, prepared pebble tools that are oval and flat. Chronologically, it is pre-Oldowan, as the pebbles are chipped on one end and one side only. Signs of secondary retouch are completely absent. Pebble cortex covers 2/3 of the total length of the tool on the both sides from the butt end. Then we have the middle Cafuan tools, another subdivision, and these are invariably smaller than those of the earlier division, but made by the same technique. Some of these tools resemble Acheulean tools, so you can see what's coming. And thirdly, finally, we have the upper Cafuan. The tools of this division are comparable to Lavoisian tools, although smaller and more cleanly finished. The lithic assemblage includes a large variety of specialized tools, including chisels, points, and scrapers. All were made from small cores. So then we come to the Middle Pleistocene Oldowan. This cultural level is contemporaneous to the Second Comasian and the Third Kageran pluvial periods. Pluvial is a period that corresponds to glacial in the north, and in the south what it means is you get a lot of rain. The culture named Oldowan after the type site at Oldowan Gorge. Originally in 1911, German entomologist Professor Catwinkle reported this significant Old Stone Age site, and later Lewis and Mary Leakey explored this gorge. Their explorations over a number of years made them famous, as they reported hominid skeletal fragments in association with pebble and flake stone tools. And along the way, they made important collections of vertebrate fauna, including the remains of birds, amphibians, snakes, lizards, rodents, pigs, and antelopes. With the help of National Geographic, they expanded their collection of tools of the Oldowan culture they placed into environmentally determined beds formed by a series of sediments. These sedimentary beds and their human and environmental contents were exposed in Olduvai Gorge, and then as they cut across the Serengeti Plain into Tanzania. Bed 1 at Olduvai is the first we're going to look at. Dr. Leakey observed a homogeneous industry in Bed 1 of Olduvai Gorge, that is, in an evolved form in comparison to the earlier Cafuan industry. This is also a pebble tool culture containing crude choppers and scrapers. As per potassium argon dating, the basal layer of Olduvai Bed 1 is 1.7 million years old. The characteristic tool type in Olduvai Bed 1 is the crude chopper in varying sizes. Its diameter ranges from that of a ping pong ball to a croquet ball. Anterior flaking makes the cutting edge. Intersection of flake scars from two directions results in an irregular jagged cutting edge. These pebble tools are found on the surface of the basal older gravel and can be compared to the earlier Acheulean or Chellean types, which belong to the Mendel glaciation in Europe. That's the second major glacial age in Europe. You have Gunz-Mendel-Reis-Würm. Now this bed has not produced any hand axes that do not appear until those hand axes don't appear until the succeeding Bed 2. Now Bed 2 in Olduvai is quite different from Bed 1 because while Bed 1 is composed of volcanic tuffs that were ejected into the lake, Bed 2 consists of marls, that is, sediments enriched with lime, and other lake sediments, and is about 90 feet thick in some places. This bed yields 5 stages of Chellean Acheulean hand axe culture. Stage 1, stone tools of this stage come from the lowest level of Bed 2. They represent a state of direct evolutionary advancement over the Oldowan tools types of Bed 1. The tools include crude and simple hand axes of Chellean type, which are made on pebbles, quartz or lava. Apart from these artifacts, some rough stone spheres, small flake tools, hammerstones, utilized flakes, and waste flakes are also found, and it's interesting that some imported lumps of rock used as raw material for tool making have also been reported from this stage, that is, rock that's not locally available. Among the fauna, there are giant baboons, Pseudopithecus, a variety of giant pigs, the huge sheep, Pelerovus, the 2 species of hippopotamus, a rhinoceros, 3-toed horse, and a 1-toed horse, and I give the scientific names as well, and numerous species of antelopes and gazelles. In Stage 2, the diagnostic tools are large hand axes with thick and massive butt ends that exhibit remarkable flattening of the lower surface. A steep ridge exists on the upper face that passes centrally along the anterior part and curves from about the center of the tool to the butt end. This particular tool type exhibits resemblances to the Eolithic rostrocarinates, or the earliest beak-shaped hand axes as found in a pre-Pleistocene bed in Europe. The tools have been recovered from a level about 10 to 15 feet above the Bed 2 and about 7 to 12 feet above those of Stage 1. The other artifact of this stage, that seems to be similar to that of Stage 2, is a flake tool made on ivory of hippopotamus. It exhibits a prominent bulb of percussion and secondary trimming at the end opposite to the butt. Then in Stage 3, from the middle part of Bed 2, about 20 feet above Stage 2, there are triangular and oval, large and thick hand axes. The lower faces of these tools are flat due to careful flaking, and the stage is very rich with these thick hand axes and stone balls. Assemblages of fauna are also remarkable. L.S.B. Leakey published in 1960 the human skull of a Chellean man, which resembles Pithecanthropus erectus, and the Steinheim skull. In stage 4, these two stages have produced many hand axes transitional to Chilean and Acheulean in typology. These hand axes have an all-round cutting edge instead of only one edge at the interior end, and they are typical tools for stage 4. The lower faces of these tools are much flatter than the upper. The leaky stage 5 consists of the junction of bed 2 and bed 3. The artifacts of this stage show conformity with the Acheulean tools, manifesting improved workmanship. A few implements show the use of a cylinder hammer technique. In bed 3 of Oldowan is also stage 6. This bed is made of terrestrial and river-borne deposits. It is known as the red bed, being composed of earth and torrential gravel. Dr. Leakey unearthed 87 isolated stone tools from different levels of bed 3 and classified this bed as stage 6 in the Chilean-Acheulean cultural sequence. These tools show a definite technological advancement over the previous stage and come from the top of bed 2. Artifacts of the cleaver type first appear at this stage. So do the stone balls of the bolas type and some prepared cores. The typical hand axes of bed 3 introduce a very developed form of cylinder hammer technique, which can be comparable to some of the finest Acheulean flaking in Europe. Bed 4 of Oldowan includes stages 7 through 11. This bed is composed of sand. At the base of this bed are many large and finely made hand axes. These artifacts are usually much wider than their length in comparison to the earlier ones. Cleavers are very common in occurrence, and they are slightly narrower at the cutting edge than the middle portion. The selection of raw materials seems to have a little influence on technology. Anyway, many perfect specimens are made of coarse-grained quartzite. Dr. Leakey recognized that the makers of these tools had achieved a high level of perfection in their workmanship, as had the people of the same time period in Europe, where the flint of finest quality was available. A small series of S-twist ovate hand axes and cleavers in the form of a V rather than a U are the diagnostic artifacts of bed 4. The uppermost part of bed 4 are often missing at Oldowan due to erosion, but a very rich site known as HK has exposed the upper part of bed 4. In 1951, a small area was excavated, giving 459 artifacts in situ. They contained a variety of hand axes and cleavers with blunted cutting edges. One hand axe is abraded from cutting up a hippopotamus carcass. These tools were apparently discarded, being left behind when wear made them unserviceable. There was plenty of white quartzite for raw material nearby, so the making of new tools was not difficult when the old ones were worn out. The western part of the southern branch of the Oldowan Gorge produced one cleaver axe that hafted, when it was hafted, could cut down a small tree with its sharp edge. Other small hand axes have been unearthed from this bed. And that brings us to the Kenya Fauresmith, F-A-U-R-E-S-M-I-T-H. The Fauresmith culture flourished in Kenya during the third pluvial or Kangerian period. This would correspond to the Rhys and glacial period in Europe. This Fauresmith culture sequence is held more or less parallel to Oldowan cultural sequence, and some scholars call Oldowan beds 3 and 4 Kenya Acheulean. Kenya Fauresmith features the appearance of Mysterion flakes, and thus is intermediate between the early and middle part of the Old Stone Age. The name derives from a site in South Africa on the Kavirondo Gulf of Lake Victoria. A few miles away from Konam in 1932, Louis Leakey discovered fragments of many human skulls in association with some extinct fauna, such as Paleolithosaurus, Pseudopithecus, and Peroovus. Now, the neighboring areas of the site yielded several Acheulean tools. Hand axes of lanceolate and ovate forms are conspicuous here, as they are in the former Acheulean stage. Many U-shaped choppers showing pebbly cortex on their butt, and a large number of specialized scrapers in association with typical Mysterion flakes. The tools are flat, small, and neat in finishing, and this indicates the development of better craftsmanship. And all of that has sociocultural evolutionary implications, which we have discussed before, we'll discuss again
in later lectures. This cultural level correlates with the fourth pluvial, that is Gamblean, which corresponds to the Würm in Europe, and features the disappearance of hand axes and cleavers. It has two culturally defined units: A, the Kenia proto-stilbe and Kenia stilbe, and B, the Kenia capsian. Going to A, although Kenia stilbe has evolved from Kenia proto-stilbe, but they have two distinct obsidian industries. The obsidian Mysterion flakes, points, side scrapers, and discs exhibit sophisticated retouch in stilbe, as opposed to the earlier proto-stilbe. And then we come to the Kenia capsian. It was originally misnamed after the Tunisian Maghreb culture typesite of Gassa, called Capsa by the Romans, but at any rate, that's how we get the name Kenia capsian, that's found in Kenya and northern Tanganyika Rift Valley. It is characterized by a flake blade industry. There's an excellent documentary on Netflix right now called The Rift Valley that you might want to take a look at. It goes into the details of the biology as well as the human occupation there. The lower level of this culture includes blades, beards, microliths, and bone tools, which bear similarity with the European Mesolithic culture. And the upper level of Kenia capsian is widespread and best known among all stone tool cultures of the Kenya Rift. This stage is marked with a steady decrease of large backed blades, beards, and end scrapers. However, the microliths, especially the lunates and triangles, are diagnostic, as are the large number of crescent-shaped microliths that are found along with. These are considered a variation of the backed blade. The tiny ones range from 1 inch to less than a ½ inch in length, and probably serve the function of barbs in harpoons, spears, and arrows. These pygmy tools were inserted in the grooves of a wooden shaft. The presence of bone harpoons, pottery, and eggshell beads in this upper level means the Capsian culture in Kenya continued into the Holocene, that is past 10,500 years ago. And that brings us to an end of our discussion of the North African and East African Lower Paleolithic, and brings you up to, you can see how much things have changed archaeologically. We have now a vast amount of information and good dates dating back 3.3 million years compared to what little was known when I started in archaeology 58 years ago.